Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Stratosphere Lounge and another technically perfect launch of the best produced show on the internet. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, and this is the 16th of January, 2020. I still wake up and press my face against the glass, hoping that the postman is going to come and deliver my jetpack, but so far, nothing. It's really pretty depressing if you really want to know. Doing pretty well otherwise. I hope everybody's doing well. Got a bunch of cool things to talk about. Then we'll take some questions and some questions from our Facebook as well as from our member only page. So that's that. Couple of things here. Hang on. There we go. That are kind of interesting and fun. So, first of all, I realized as I was setting up for the show tonight that I forgot to strip the sound out of the last one, so I'll try and do both of those this evening because of reasons. And a special friend too. Hello to our friend Dave Big Booty and all the rest of the gang here, everybody who's in the comment section, and those of you and all the ships at sea. So just a couple things real quick. First of all, real quick, despite the fact that I've been working like a fiend on this Cold War thing for 4 or 5 months now, which I'll get to in a minute, in the vast amount of time I have between that and doing 11 shows a week and all the rest of it, I was able to slowly move forward on some of this this animation stuff for these science fiction videos that we're going to piggyback on top of Star Citizen. I had to put them away for 18 months because just couldn't run them any longer. We're just running out of company. I just neglected it for too long. But made some real progress recently. Here, kind of by myself. There's just to give you an idea of what's been happening. I have a program called DAZ 3D, and it's a character generator, and it's a really good character generator. The problem is at the end is that the particular software has no animation abilities whatsoever. I mean, technically it does, but it's designed for people to do still pictures. And when you look at most of the horror that's on DAZ and the photos that come out of it, I mean, I don't know who's this for. It looks like the kind of thing that my Aunt Marty might have gotten interested in, to do little poses of couples on the beach or whatever. Most of it is just such dreck. But having looked around extensively, there was nothing I could find that was even close to it in terms of making believable characters. Not necessarily photorealistic, but close enough. Close enough certainly for me to be happy with what I want to do. So I made a bunch of characters in DAZ, and we all saw those when I stopped about a year ago. Stopped working on this stuff because I just couldn't do it. More than that, year and a half almost now. And my problem was I'd make these awesome characters in DAZ 3D. I just genuinely loved them. I loved them. I thought they were great. Here's an example, although this is a pretty old version of Boyd. But this is the kind of thing that I can do in DAZ. And I think these characters look great. I think they look absolutely fantastic. If I could get these guys animated and moving, I'd be a happy camper. But the happiness of this camper has been severely impacted by the fact that while this software allows me to make these great characters, I could not get them exported. I could not. I spent the first 18 months working on this, trying to figure out how I was going to do this. Was I going to send them to Maya, animated in Maya, what a 3D Studio, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And finally, I realized that the only way to do these things within any kind of a reasonable framework was to render them, to send them over to a game engine and do them live in the game engine. So, or at least close to live. So those days and days and days and days and days of rendering in 3D Studio or rendering some of these files in DAZ, gone. Game Engine is just astonishing what it'll do, mostly with textures replacing geometry, but that's a whole different story. Anyway, the problem I had in terms of not making any progress with this was I had these characters I liked. I went looking for characters that you could just drop into Unreal Engine. And I mean, when I went looking, I mean, I ran out of internet. There was nothing else I could find. I spent 6, 7, 8, well, I spent more than that. I spent a year and a half looking for characters that I thought were as good as what I wanted to do. And I couldn't find any. So the problem was getting these characters from out of DAZ and into Unreal. And for the longest time, it was just not possible. Now, there was software called iClone by Real Illusion. They're the same guys that do the voice over IP, the face over IP, the same people that allowed you to do, just take a webcam and move your facial things onto a character inside Star Citizen. And I did a couple of test videos here about a year ago now, I guess. And it just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough resolution in the face. And even though it's very impressive for a game, you can't get the nuance that I needed to tell stories. You can get enough to tell like battle scenes and things like that, but if you really want to tell a story, you've got to be able to read emotion. Otherwise, you end up telling people things, and it's not about telling people. It's about showing people, and that means that these digital characters have to be able to deliver a performance, and just wasn't there in the game. And I looked at some of these iClone characters, and I thought they were just really not impressive at all. But I could not get from DAZ into Unreal Engine. But a year and a half went by, and then I took a look again, and iClone had come out, Real Illusion rather, had come out with a new version of their character creator, which had like a digital human shading for the skin, and it looked a lot better. And they had simplified an awful lot the export procedures and import procedures and all the rest of it. I won't bore you with all the details, but in any event, I want to say about 3-4 weeks ago, I was actually able to get 5-6 weeks ago, I was able to get a DAZ character into iClone, but I couldn't get the character to look the same. The morphs on the face weren't coming in. They were coming into 3D Exchange, but they weren't coming into what I needed. Anyway, it was one checkbox that I'd missed, and I took a long time to do it, but here's where we are now. As of 2 days ago, I finally got a character out of DAZ into character creator. That turns it into a Real Illusion iClone character, exported that to iClone, did some animation in iClone, and then iClone sets up a link that goes directly to Unreal in real time. So you split your screen in half, and on one side you're seeing the animation in iClone, and it's directly porting that over to Unreal, where you get to see everything else. So you do the animations and maybe move the lights in iClone, but you let the game engine, because iClone has, I think, probably easier animation tools, and then you let the game engine do the rest. And all of the things that are available to the game engine, the entire planetscapes and sets, hundreds and hundreds of things like, I don't know, probably 30 science fiction sets, world builders. You just get all these different platforms to start building them. Now that's a level builder thing, and I'm not a level builder, although I know what I want, so it's going to take me a while to do that too. But nevertheless, anyway, finally, I was able to get a character doing the facial animation. Now, it exported using the morphs from DAZ. I know I'm going a little into the weeds here, but, we often go over the same ground, and sometimes it likes to go about something new. So basically what happens is you've got a mesh of this character's face, and I think I showed you before the pretty much final look on this guy that I really think is where I want to stay. I'm going to grab it someplace. It's in here somewhere. Doesn't matter. Nope, hang on. So So basically, my problem was to get. Here we go. Yeah, we showed you these a couple weeks ago, but I'll show them to you again. I'll just show you one. So my problem then became, how do I get this into, wait, that's kind of scary, actually. Hey, it's me. How's it going? Could probably do a little better than that. Hang on a second. Yeah, so the problem was to get this level of realism. I'm very happy with. I can certainly live with that. And this is kind of the character that I'm going to be talking with from now on. So I'll just do Stratosphere Lounge kind of like this from now on. Anyway, I had to get that over to UE4, which I was able to do. And I was able to animate the face. Oops, hang on. But I'll just be the two of us here for the time being. But if you look at that expression on the character's face, it's made possible by something called morphs. In other words, the character's face is a 3D mesh, and it's got a neutral expression, and then you can drop and drag expressions to put on there, which morphs the head. It changes the shape of the lips and the smile and the mouth, the eyes, and all of that. So that's how you get the expressions on there through these morphs. And Daz exports these morphs, and those morphs then get changed into Character Creator, and then they get sent to Unreal. But the problem is, the problem is that the morphs that Daz exports are kind of, no, they're really the morphs that Reallusion, the iClone people, import. The morphs are not very good. They're kind of generic, so you get smiles that are kind of, and just weirdness. So the next step is I have to take this 3D mesh character, which I like an awful lot, and then I have to send him to a company named Polywink. And Polywink is going to make very detailed morphs, because when I do the facial capture, what I'm really doing is I'm sending a series of signals to iClone or Unreal, and I'm telling them by the position of my face at any given time, what morphs can you find? What morphs? If, in other words, if I smile, it's going to try and match my face to the closest morphs that it has, and so on. So anyway, the more detailed the morphs, the more what's the word I'm looking for? The more faithful. The more faithful the expressions are. So I'm going to have to send this off to some people, have them do the custom morphs, and at that point, then I will be able to really get actual expressions on this dude, which makes me very, very happy. So I think I can see it from here. And this entire process, if you want to know what it's like, this entire process is having a croquet ball on the ground and thinking that you could just tap it and have it go in through the wickets. But you find out that this croquet ball, on the grass, and the croquet ball weighs 40,000 tons. And instead of the ball just rolling along, you have to take a sledgehammer. This is what it feels like doing the work I've been doing, and hit it with all you've got. And if you put all of your effort into it, you might move it half an inch. So bang, 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 bang. I just, God almighty. Anyway, it's actually starting to work. So that is promising. Not be able to get into it for another 3 weeks yet, but then the great BillWhittle.com writing desert or drought, whatever you prefer, will come to an end, because in 2-3 weeks, 4 at the top, I'll be finished with the Cold War thing. 12 episodes. I'm wrapping up episode 10 now. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, because not only is it fun to talk to you guys about this, I get great feedback, and a lot of times when you explain something, you make it clearer for yourself in explaining it. And so the last script, which I turned in last Friday, which was the one about Project Azorian and the SR-70, 812, and it's called Cloaks and Daggers. It was about all the espionage during the Cold War. I think it's the best script in the series. I love it. I love it. Recording that tomorrow. So that got me on and off through the early 70s. And at some point, you have to get off the linear thing. So I've got 3 episodes left, 10, 11, and 12. And I have to go from really, I mean, the granularity going from 1948 to about 1965 was very fine. And I found myself like, I'm out of scripts, and I've got so much to do. So I had a pretty good feeling that obviously the Vietnam War has to be covered, but covering the Vietnam War is tricky because it alone is such an astonishingly detailed thing. Unlike the Korean War, which I covered in episode 3 or 4 or something. There's just so much written about Vietnam, and I only have a chance to kind of dip a couple toes in the water and then move on. And so I was trying to find a way to organize this. And when I say organize it, not just organize it in terms of structure, but organize it in terms of theme. And I've made a distinct effort to make sure that I don't call these things like the Korean War or the Berlin. I don't want anything that's just too on the nose. The Bay of Pigs episode I called Playa Hiron, which was the beach where they went ashore. Anyway, I had to think of something for this period. Now, here's the part I'm actually interested in getting some feedback on. I was going to call the Vietnam episode Welcome to the Suck. And that's a term that was used when a bunch of FNGs would get off the big silver bird from the world, and they'd land in Vietnam, and they'd realize, man, here we are, and they'd find themselves out in the bush somewhere in the jungle. And anytime anybody looked around with that look like, what the hell's going on here, it was pretty common to say, welcome to the suck. And so episode 10 is called Welcome to the Suck. And then I had this kind of idea. Because, and I mean, I had this idea half an hour ago. I have to cover more ground than Vietnam. Vietnam ended, really, the shooting ended in 72. By the time the Democrats lost the peace, it was 74. And I got to move. I got to cover the Vietnam War, and I got to go further. In fact, next episode 11, is called The Liberators, and that starts with Reagan and Thatcher and Pope John Paul II and all the rest of it. So I got to cover some ground here, and I got to cover ground after Vietnam. And then I realized, because this part of the Cold War I was around for, I realized that the suck is not so much a place. The suck, in my analysis now, was a period of time. Because I start this episode off by talking about something that my friend in Norway had told me a story when he was in UDT, underwater demolition teams, before they became the SEALs. Told me a story that was just incredible. So I open with this story of what these 2 divers experienced. And then I say, I'll just read it. I love reading it every now and then. So here we go. So this is where I was going with the episode. So this is kind of the transition thing. This was the Cold War II, dark and dangerous. Alone or in pairs, men would swim for miles through the ink-black darkness or lie breathless as a line of enemy troops stomped through the heavy bush just a few feet away. The Cold War was fought deep in the bowels of unglamorous, unromantic supply ships, with men peeling potatoes in sweltering galleys that could reach 110 degrees with 100% humidity. The Cold War was fought in parkas and heavy mittens at remote radar installations on the frozen Canadian wilderness. It was fought in dark basements littered with cigarette butts and styrofoam coffee cups by analysts who listened with mind-numbing boredom for an enemy transition worth intercepting. It was fought in Quonset huts with typewriters by quartermasters who had to feed, house, and then move tens of thousands of men. And it was fought in recruiting offices, often by hardened former warriors who now commanded desks instead of fire bases and had to defend themselves not from incoming enemy fire, but rather the spit and insults from their fellow American citizens. The term was coined in Vietnam, but it applied equally well to any FNG just getting off of one of those just starting on one of those dirty, thankless jobs that were faithfully carried out for 40 years. Welcome to the suck, kid. So I'll just read the next paragraph, and if the lawsuit comes from them, then it comes. What can I do? Because this is the thing this is kind of this insight I had. This is the theory. It says the suck wasn't limited to where you were stationed. In fact, the suck wasn't strictly confined to Vietnam. In my opinion, looking back at all of it, it seems to me that the suck was a specific period of time that began in 1964 and ended in 1980. Now, that doesn't mean that everything between 1964 and 1980 was part of the suck. On the contrary, the biggest and best part of the space race was, in fact, the period when the biggest and best part of the space race took place during the suck, including the flight of Apollo 11 in 1969. The space race was, in fact, the period when the vague, gauze-like sequence of events called the Cold War came into sharpest focus. The space race was its own self-contained story, which I covered in 4.5-hour detail right here on Esoteric Radio Theater in the series Apollo 11, What We Saw. The link is in the description below. But here's the point. But putting that aside, perhaps the best way to think about the suck was that it marked a break between Cold War I, where most of the interesting stuff occurred, and Cold War II, which began at the end of the suck in 1980. Much of what I'm calling the suck took place in Vietnam, but much of it took place after Vietnam as well. The suck was a worldwide phenomenon, and if we're going to put another milestone down to make some sense out of this 42-year conflict, then I maintain that the suck started on August 2nd, 1964. You could ask most people on the street, in fact, virtually anybody on the street, what happened on August 2nd, 1964, and most of them will look at you in amazement, but this audience is going to give me 15 different replies of what happened in August 2nd, 1964. And because there's an 8 or 10 second delay between when I record this and when I see the replies in the live stream here on Twitch, I sometimes have to wait for that. But anyway, yes, here they come. Here they come. Bing, ding, 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 ding. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, based on the Gulf of Tonkin event, where Vietnamese torpedo boats came out to USS Haddocks, was it? I think I'm looking at it. And as a result of this encounter, Johnson was given all kinds of powers to escalate the Vietnam War. Now, a lot of people say that, that the Vietnam War was a tragic mistake and so on, and it was a catastrophe. It certainly didn't go the way it should have gone, but nobody knows what would have happened if it hadn't been fought. This idea of domino theory was actually a pretty sound theory. But clearly, from the beginning, well, not from the beginning, from 1964, from the beginning of the suck, America's politicians, I should say, went completely bat guano crazy. They went crazy. And what I mean by that was the way that Johnson fought this war from 1964 until he was defeated by Richard Nixon in 1968 is insane. It's insane. You look at it and you can't believe it actually happened. And to be somebody on the ground or at the point of the spear and having to live through this, honest to God, I don't know how. I don't know how they took it, but that's why it was the suck. Most of this, in fact, virtually all of it, in fact, probably all of it, was due to these political rules of engagement, these political restraints that were put on the soldiers, and by the warriors, by the airmen and the sailors and the soldiers, Marines, and so on. And some of these rules of engagement were beyond belief, simply almost beyond belief. it kind of it harkened back a little bit to what we saw in Korea, where we had specific rules where you could not violate Chinese airspace. MiGs would come from Chinese airspace, fly over, and then if they got back over the Yalu or whatever, we couldn't pursue them. So, yeah, Mobile Moto said rules of lawyer-induced suicide. That's pretty much it. Yes, it's true. John Pershing points out that Johnson wasn't defeated in '68. That's true. Nixon won, but Johnson removed himself from consideration. He didn't actually run. He did very badly in an early primary, and he just said, "I'm out." Anyway, so even in Korea, we had this kind of half in, half out kind of thing. We're attacked by Chinese jets. They call them North Korean jets, but we all know what they were. And they would attack us, and then they would just hop over the river, and we couldn't touch them. So they can go back and forth, and we can't. And for the life of me, I'll never understand this. But the rules of engagement in Vietnam boggle the mind. And undoubtedly, there are many on the ground that I'm not aware of. I know the ones in the air a little better. One of the most specific cases of the rules of engagement in the air had a lot to do with the kind of airplanes they were flying. These are early generation missile carrying fighters, and they were pretty crappy airplanes. American airplanes. The Soviets were building the MiG-15, then the MiG-17 was a better jet, and the MiG-19 was better than that. And the MiG-21 was a really small, very easy to manufacture jet, but it was very agile. And guys like Robert McNamara were speaking on behalf of most of the Pentagon when they thought, no. The answer is just get bigger and bigger, faster, and heavier jets, slap a bunch of missiles on them, and then you won't need to dogfight because you're never going to get into a dogfight. Well, that didn't work out so well. It was going to happen anyway that they were going to get into dogfights, but the rules of engagement said. So just think about this. The U.S. Air Force strategy coming from the Pentagon is, we don't need agile fighter jets because we'll knock them down with missiles. Well, the Sparrow, I don't know what the Sparrow's KP percentage of kills was in Vietnam. I think it's around 10%. So, number one, the missiles that we're going to use to knock down these enemy fighters are not terribly reliable. And here's the part that just makes you just want to just drop your rice bowl. Even though that was the strategy, the rules of engagement said that you couldn't shoot. DP Wellman says less than 2%. You couldn't shoot until you had visually identified them as enemy aircraft. In other words, you couldn't use the missiles until the missiles were useless because you were too close to the enemy jet. Now you're in knife fighting range, and this MiG-21 is going to turn inside you, and down you go. And the Korean War air-to-air kill ratio was 14-1 in favor of the Americans because the F-86 was just a flying wing, and that beast could turn inside anybody. It was flown by World War II pilots who were 5 years out of the war. I mean, the F-86 Sabre was an amazing fighter. Lightweight, tough, fast, beautiful airplane. And by the time we get to Vietnam, this whole period in between is bulking these things up because the Air Force is thinking it's all nuclear bombers. What do we need a tactical Air Force for? And so what you found when you got to Vietnam was you found American, the kill ratio in the air over Vietnam fell to 2-1, and some people argue that it was 1-1. In other words, we were losing an aircraft for every time the enemy lost an aircraft in air-to-air combat. And that is not acceptable. So in this episode, we're going to make a little reference. We're going to get to John Boyd a little later in the episode, and I've been over Boyd many times. I'm not going to go over that now, but John Boyd basically looked at what was happening and said, hey, the reason this is happening is because the Russians have better jets than we do. What? And Boyd and the fighter mafia ended up designing the F-15 and the F-16, as well as the A-10, which I would argue, until we see how the F-22s and F-35s do, I would argue that those three aircraft are the most successful aircraft ever in any Air Force over any time. So here's what happened. The reason that this period was called was the suck was because Johnson himself, through McNamara, had ordered that these airstrikes that we were launching on, let's say, a Vietnam factory or something, inside of Vietnam, the order was that these strikes had to come in. I actually can't believe I'm saying this out loud because it is so crazy to me that I absolutely just hard to believe. I can hardly credit that it actually took place, but apparently it did. First of all, Navy guys coming in from the aircraft carriers off of Yankee Station would fly over Da Nang Harbor and they'd look down and they'd see the SAM missiles that are going to kill them next week being offloaded from these Soviet freighters, and we're not allowed to touch them because we might accidentally kill a Russian if we did that. So the Russians are down there unloading their SAMs, and no, can't touch them. But even worse than that, because you can at least make some kind of political argument about that, not wanting to get into world war with the Soviets. But even worse than that was that when these guys were given targets, they had to come in at the same altitude, the same speed, the same compass heading, and the same time of day. Let me just say that again because it's not possible to believe it's true. They were ordered to come in at the same altitude, the same airspeed, the same direction, and the same time of day, which meant that if airstrike after airstrike after airstrike is coming in, not only could you set up SAMs and anti-aircraft artillery and Vector fighters there, I mean, it's just a matter of time before you just put up big enough nets and just catch the jets. I mean, it's just plain madness. And how these guys in these air crews did it, I do not know. But the reason I set all this up is a couple of people have asked about it in the comments, but this is where I was going the whole time. The reason I set all this up, because this is what I want to talk about, then we'll get into the questions, was because this was so predictable that 2 or 3 years into the suck in 1967, Robin Olds, a colonel in the United States Air Force, pretty sure it was Olds, came up with this thing called Operation Bolo. Now, we'd done these raids with tactical bombers, linebacker and so on. We were just getting murdered. And it was a turkey shoot. It was a turkey shoot for the North Vietnamese, for the bad guys. So, to give you an idea of the quality of the aircraft that we were flying then, the F-105 Thunder Chief was the primary fighter bomber of the war. The F-100 did it as well. The F-100 wasn't a great dogfighter, but the F-105, in my opinion, was one of the worst things we ever put in the air. The F-105 Thunder Chief had two names reliably used by its pilots. They called it either the Thud or the Lead Sled, which give you an idea of how that aircraft performed. It was designed mostly to be an interceptor, go fast in a straight line. And this thing was just, we would send F-105 Thunder Chiefs in there again and again and again and again and again without any air-to-air capability whatsoever, and just wait for the MiGs to come down and pick them off. Anyway, we have been doing this for so long that it was essentially a feeding time for the North Vietnamese Air Force. It's like, well, here come the Americans, and they don't have any air cover, and they're flying these big, heavy, bulky, slow, well, not necessarily slow, but ponderous kind of bombers that can't turn. And these North Vietnamese aircraft would go in there, and they wouldn't even have to use their missiles. They just use guns. They get inside these things, just shoot them out of the sky. And it went on and on and on and on and on. And finally, you run into a commander who's not only as upset as the rest of the commanders, but has got a plan to do something and somehow got it approved. So we were flying F-105s in on this target, and the F-105s were using the same call sign, on the same frequencies, and they'd been doing this for months, just basically handing out cards saying, this is where we'll be when you're ready to shoot us down. So these F-105s are going in there and getting slaughtered. And one day, Robin Olds has this plan. He says, well, I'm getting tired of being ambushed. Maybe it's time to ambush them for a change. That sounds like an interesting idea. So what he did was he took when I say our best air-to-air fighter, was our only air-to-air fighter, was the F-4 Phantom, which I've probably built more Phantom models than anything in the world. I've easily built 30 of them in 1/72nd scale, and I love the Phantom, but the Phantom is not. The Phantom's not the F-86, and it's not the F-16, F-15. The Phantom is the fighter of the suck. My favorite term for the Phantom that pilots called it was they called it the Smoking Thunderhog, which I just love the sound of. They called it the Smoking Thunderhog because these particular jet engines left a big black trail of soot behind them, and it's essentially a black arrow pointing to where the jet is. If, in case you North Vietnamese pilots are not able to see it, we'll put a big black streak across the whole sky, so you've got an arrow pointing to where our jets are. The Smoking Thunderhawk. I didn't know exactly this, but Mobile Moto says it was the first plane that was unstable in all axes. Yeah. Foghorn says we still call it the Rhino. I'd be willing to bet that the Rhino designation came along with the F4E. The first F4s, I think probably the C model, had a pretty short nose. And it was basically a Navy jet. And McNamara said, why buy a number of different jets? Why not just make the Air Force have it? So the Air Force had to take this Navy jet. Twin engine, very heavy fighter, and the first ones had really pretty short nose, and they had no guns, none. They weren't. It's not like the guns weren't accurate. There was no gun on the airplane. In fact, the only aircraft that had a gun during the first part of the suck in Vietnam, in fact, throughout virtually all of it, was the F-8 Crusader Navy fighter. It's the only one that had a gun that was worth a damn. So the Phantoms are these big airplanes, but when they got a little more evolved, they stretched the nose quite a bit and cranked it down and put a cannon underneath the nose. And the F-4E was the first one capable of actually shooting back. But this was our best fighter jet. But here's the point. The F-4 was an air-to-air platform. It may have not been terribly agile, but it was fast. And it had pretty good thrust to weight ratio compared to some of the North Korean jets like the MiG-21. Jump ahead just a little bit here. When Boyd did his analysis of enemy aircraft versus ours, and he came up with his energy management theory, Boyd said to the Pentagon during his famous briefing, he said the MiG-21 is a far superior dogfighter to the F-4. How can you say such a thing? We're the Americans. Look at, here's the statistics. Here are the dead pilots. What else do you need? And Boyd figured out, just through sheer mathematics, he said that I'm taking examples here, and I'm not 100% sure they're right, but just bear with me because this is the essence of the argument. Boyd was saying if you run into a MiG-19 and you decide to fight the MiG-19 at less than 350 knots, you're going to die. Because the the MiG-19 will outturn you and shoot you down every single time. You find yourself in the same air with a MiG-19 and you fight them below 350 knots, and you're going to go down. And that's what is happening out there in the real world all the time. But Boyd figured that since these light Russian jets did not have hydraulic assistance controls, they were direct linkage. They were pulling either push-pull rods or cables even. That once you got above 350 knots, even the strongest pilot, using all of his strength, pulling back on the stick, could not turn the jet at a rate that the jet was capable of turning. It was a weakness in the airplane. And that above 350 knots, the hydraulic systems on the Phantom continue to pull G's until the jet comes apart. Or the pilot blacks out, probably the last one. So Boyd said, if you run into I'm condensing the argument, but he says if you run into a MiG-19 out there, you had better get yourself to 350, 400 knots, 450 if you can do it. And if you're going that fast, you will be able to outturn him because the pilot does not have the physical strength to crank that more maneuverable jet around. And sure enough, even though the Pentagon, we want the F-111, which is a flying bus. That's going to be our fighter jet. Somehow the word got back to the guys on the ground out there, and American pilots started doing this, and immediately went from 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 to 7-to-1, just immediately. Anyway, that's later. So back to Bolo. So they've got a day, and they're going to launch another one of these F-105 bombing missions on the same schedule at the same time, coming in from the same direction, using the same call signs, all of this stuff. And Robin Olds said, yeah, we're going to make a little bit of a surprise for them. So what they did was they loaded this entire flight, I don't know, from the pictures, it looks like maybe 20, 30 aircraft, something like that. And instead of sending up the F-105s, which were pigs, and loaded with bombs on top of it. What he did was he put all the air-to-air ordnance he could find on an equal number of F-4s, so no F-105s flew. And the genius of this was, when he took off, he had the F-4s using the same call signs, the same exact call signs that the F-105s had used. And he flew them at F-105 speeds and at F-105 altitudes. And he didn't do anything that the F-105 couldn't do. Unless you were in visual contact with that jet, you would have no way to know that this was not another F-105 strike. They came in exactly the same way they always had, and at exactly the same time with exactly the same call signs. So once again, the North Vietnamese pilots say, hey, here comes lunch. Fantastic. Let's go up and knock down another 5 or 6 American jets. So basically, the entire Vietnamese Air Force is up there feeding on these lead sleds. Only this particular day, they came up, and instead of finding these lumbering, heavy, essentially defenseless F-105s, they found the sky was filled with air-to-air F-4s, and they were in a rather angry mood. And so it was like the greatest air-to-air ambush of all time. My recollection is we shot down 7 or 8 of the enemy aircraft, didn't lose any, and furthermore, 8 aircraft was half of the North Vietnamese Air Force. So, this is not, well, Bolo is clearly something to be proud of. The reason that Bolo worked is because of the suck. Bolo worked because we had given them so many opportunities to shoot down these bombers that they thought it was just another one. But that's no excuse for why Bolo worked. Anyway, so the suck consists of Bolo. The suck consists of Tet, which was a huge defeat for the communists, but reported by Walter Cronkite as the end of the war that we couldn't possibly win. And so that was that. And then when the war ended, they wouldn't come to the table after Tet. Nixon decided to bomb the living daylights out of downtown Hanoi. Next thing you know, they're there ready to talk. The war ends with the North Vietnamese above the border. And while there had been just awful desolation and millions of Vietnamese killed and 52,000 Americans as well, or 58,000, I guess, nevertheless, when we left Vietnam, the situation was the same as when we started Vietnam. So if it's not a win in terms of turning back the invasion, it's certainly a tie at the very least. And then we promised we'd replace anything that the South Vietnamese did. So if they lost a jet, we'd give them a jet. If they lost a helicopter, we'd give them a helicopter. If they fired 15 rounds, we'd give them 15 rounds. And then comes Watergate, which is a big part of the suck. And then the Democrats sweep to power, and they basically just say goodbye to South Vietnam. We're out of here. But you promised. Yeah. But we're Democrats, so it doesn't really matter. So off they went. And then the next thing you know, the Vietnamese start poking to see if the U.S. is going to respond, and we didn't. And then they go marching down into Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. And you get the elevator on the embassy, which is probably the iconic picture, that last helicopter leaving the U.S. Embassy with just streams of people like ants trying to get on it. I think that's the iconic photo for the absolute apex of the suck. And then what happened after that? Well, we were out of there by 72, 73. By 74, we were pretty much right out of there, absolutely demoralized. The country, had already gone through most of the worst of the 60s, and we started to get into the wide decade. That's what James Lilacs called it, the wide decade, when wide lapels, wide ties. This is when I grew up. And it was just, I had a friend named Lee Kolosna, and he said, we were 16, 17 years old, in high school, 11th grade, I want to say. And we were sitting there one night in one of the only other cool things that happened during the 70s, which was one of those custom vans. Those things were awesome. And we were sitting there one night late, just talking as we usually did. And he said, this isn't 1976. He said, you realize that we live in the in the dullest period of history, right? Ever. This is the most boring time in history. Nothing's going on, and he was right. Vietnam was over, and everybody was demoralized. I had a friend join Air Force Combat Control in 1976, and the military was absolutely downtrodden. Along comes Jimmy Carter, and then the Arab oil embargo, which started before Carter. But instead of Carter doing something about it, he says, well, just set your thermostat for 62 and wear a sweater at home. And then Carter says there's a malaise, there's a strange kind of a depression sitting over America. And most of it was you, Jim. And we had the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and we had Desert One, this catastrophe. We let the Iranians, go to war with us, overrun our embassy, keep our hostages for 444 days, 52 hostages, 444 days. And here we were, the world's greatest superpower, put man on the moon 5 years ago, and now we can't stop a couple of bearded Islamic lunatics from keeping our guys forever. And so the suck started in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin, and the suck didn't end until the first Tuesday in November of 1980. And the official end of the suck was an hour after Reagan was sworn in as president, when the Iranians released the hostages with no conditions, because they were pretty sure that Reagan and Haig weren't going to be the same as Jimmy Carter. And that was the end of the suck. So that's what I'm working on now. It was nice to be able to talk about it, get a little more clear on it, but as far as I know, I'm the only person to define this period not only as the suck, but and I'm not claiming credit for this because I'm sure 200 historians have already done it already, but it seems to me that from 1964 until 1980 was the absolute nadir of U.S. morale and U.S. capability, and then Ronald Reagan, like that. Here come our hostages, and air traffic controllers are threatening to go on strike. Well, they're not allowed to. Well, they just went on strike. Well, they're fired, and on and on and on. So I contend that there really was kind of two Cold Wars. Cold War I was 1948 Berlin airlift up until let's say the end of the Vietnam War in mid-suck. And then the second, the Soviets went through their own suck, by the way, because the late 60s to through all the 70s was Leonid Brezhnev, who was a child. And that's when Soviet society completely stagnated. They kept building conventional forces. And we kept trying to, kind of gild the lily and make better and better stuff because we didn't have the money or the means or the manpower to put out that many of all of those things. So anyway, yeah, Dave Booty points out that the Miracle on Ice was part of the ending of the suck. It's 1980 Olympics, was it? Must have been. Where the bunch of American college kids beat the biggest professional hockey team in the world, which was the Red Army hockey team. Things started picking up. The next thing you know, Reagan's president, and the next thing you know, we're back in business, and walking tall again. And there's a Charlie Daniels song that doesn't get played much anymore called In America. And it's like, you never did think this would, you never did think that we'd ever get together again. Well, we damn sure fooled you, walking real loud and we're talking real proud again. And I was there for that. I saw it. I saw the whole thing. And that song was very popular. So anyway, it's good for me to talk about one episode at a time as I get into it because it, like I say, helps clarify where I'm going and what I'm doing. But I really am fond of this. I thought about it. I thought of the title, Welcome to the Suck for Vietnam, for 3 months ago. But lately, as in like half an hour before the show started, I said, why don't we just call this whole period the suck? And I love it. I think it's really cool. So anyway, sorry about that. Onward and upward. let's see what we can. Let's see what we may find in the depths of the internet.